Richard Rorty lists Martin Heidegger as one of the three most important philosophers of the 20th century. Even those of us who would propose a very different list from the one Rorty proposes, nevertheless would have to admit Heidegger's a very important figure, crucial not only for German philosophy, but for the development of continental philosophy. In addition, he has some deep insights, I think, that allow us to understand not only later developments like existentialism or some aspects of postmodernism, but also to understand more about the nature of Kant's critical project and a general strategy you might trace all the way back to Plato of using transcendental arguments to reach philosophical conclusions. So I think Heidegger is an illuminating figure to study. Now, for a long time, analytic philosophers paid him no attention. If anything, they thought he was to be dismissed as constantly spouting absurdities. But I think increasingly, analytic philosophers are beginning to turn toward Martin Heidegger, understanding that he's actually, if sometimes in obscure language, expressing some deep philosophical points and raising some deep philosophical questions. So today I want to talk about his first major work, 1927, Being and Time. Later we'll talk about other aspects of his philosophy, the essay on truth, the famous turn, and contributions to philosophy. But for today, let's focus on Being and Time. Heidegger calls the project of Being and Time fundamental ontology. He distinguishes that from vulgar ontology. In Russell's language, cataloging the furniture of the world, he says, no, I'm after something deeper. I want to understand being itself, not simply what there is, but what it is to be. And so he dedicates the work to the study of Dasein. Literally, in German, that just means there being there. And it's a little hard to see what Dasein exactly is supposed to be. But the idea is that being is being in a world, being in a particular place at a particular time in a particular world. And he thinks that's important for understanding the nature of being itself. What is it to be? What is it for a thing to exist? Well, the first thing we can say is it's for it to exist somewhere, sometime, in some particular possible world. And once we understand that, we understand we're not just studying Sein, being. We're studying Dasein. That is to say, being located, being in a particular place, time, world, etc. And so that's going to be an important theme of the work. Now, there is a kind of ambiguity here, because although we're studying the nature of being there, being located in a world, we're also studying the nature of consciousness. We're also studying particular people, particular consciousnesses. And so one possible criticism of Heidegger is that there is a kind of systematic, you might say, ambiguity about the basic term of the work. Are we talking about individual consciousnesses, or consciousness itself, or being in a world itself? In a sense, we're talking about all three. And so we'll have to keep all three in mind as we go through and make sure that what's being said makes sense at all three levels. We can see the aspect of Dasein that's involved with consciousness if we see what he says about Dasein. He says, Dasein is a being that does not simply occur among other beings. Rather, it is ontically distinguished by the fact that in its being, this being is concerned about its very being. Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, in terms of its possibility to be itself and not to be itself. Well, that phrasing, to be or not to be itself, is rather interesting. It's what Heidegger considers a fundamental ontological question, the existential question, he calls it. And that itself is intriguing for its anticipation of later existentialist themes. But what I want to focus on here is that he's thinking of Dasein as something that is engaged in a project of self-understanding. It is essential to Dasein that it reflect on itself, that it try to understand itself. And so right away we can see that we're dealing with a certain kind of self-conscious, reflective being, a human being, as opposed to, well, something else that exists in a world, like the chair I'm sitting on. It's something that doesn't really reflect on itself, at least I don't think it does, but human beings do. And so we're talking about a particular way of being in a world, a human way of being in the world. Well, if it's essential to Dasein that it is there, that it is being in a world, we have to ask not only what being is, but what a world is. What is it to be in a world? Here Heidegger says something surprising. You might think that consciousness is something that, in some sense, depends on the world, but he turns that around. Instead, the world is defined in terms of consciousness. A world is the sort of thing that Dasein can be in. And so rather than Dasein being the kind of thing that can reflect on its own existence and its own significance within a world, instead a world is the kind of thing that is a home for Dasein. And so that reversal is a characteristic idealistic move. I think here there is a split among Heidegger scholars about how to interpret this. Some Heideggerians think of him as giving us a kind of common sense picture of the world, and in many ways he thinks of himself as giving us a common sense picture of the world. But he's also the heir to an idealist tradition coming from Kant, Hegel, and a variety of thinkers in between. And I think here we see one manifestation of that. He's thinking of the world as, in some sense, dependent on consciousness, rather than consciousness dependent on the world. How does Dasein relate to the world? In most of Western philosophy, the answer has been, well, consciousness is aware of the world. It knows things, it believes things, it desires things. Heidegger's answer is different. The fundamental relationship between Dasein, consciousness for the moment, and the world is caring. We are essentially beings who care, and objects in the world present themselves to us as objects that are of some practical use. He loves the example of a hammer. A hammer is not something that is simply given, simply found. It has a particular use, and it presents itself to us as something that's useful. The camera I'm looking at is something that presents itself to me as something useful, something to be used for a particular purpose. Now you might think, well, that's fine for cameras and for hammers. They're artifacts after all. They're tools being created by human beings for a particular purpose. But what about other things? What about air or water or the plants around us or rocks? Are they things that present themselves to be used? Well, he says yes, fundamentally. Now, once we get to a certain stage, we abstract away from the usefulness, and we can think about those objects as they are in themselves. But that involves, he thinks, a kind of bracketing, a kind of separating off of the object itself from its use for us. We initially approach the objects of the world as things that are of potential use. And so the relationship we have to the world, and this includes to other beings, other human beings in the world, is fundamentally one of caring. So you can right away see that an ethics built on this is going to be quite different from a Kantian rationalistic ethics or a utilitarian ethic. It's going to be one that takes caring as fundamental. It is going to be, at root, an ethic of care, and as we'll see, also an ethic of authenticity. But it's something that involves a different kind of relation to the world from the ones that Western philosophers have usually stressed. One way of putting it is that our fundamental relationship to the world is not epistemic, it's pragmatic. We basically approach the world as something to be used for our own purposes. There's something a bit dominating about that, perhaps, but on the other hand, it's something that we immediately recognize, even as small children. The baby encounters the world and immediately thinks about relating that world to itself. And so we come into the world thoroughly absorbed in the world and see the world as something interconnected to ourselves. It's not as if we come into the world strangers to the world, in fact looking around at it as objects to which we don't relate. Instead, we come into the world absorbed in it, related to it, seeing it as related to us. And so we shouldn't think of this as a relation of domination, of us having the world around simply as a tool for ourselves. It's rather that we come into the world as fully part of it, fully absorbed in it, as related to it. And we have to take a step back and abstract away to take the perspective that most Western philosophy has taken about the relationship between human beings and the world. Instead, we're immediately related, we're immediately entwined in the world.